He was 21 years old, raised in a mansion by the Pacific Ocean, the son of an FBI agent turned corporate security chief. He had every advantage America could offer a young man in 1974. Within 3 years, he would become one of the most damaging spies in the history of the Cold War, and the man who caught him would be his own best friend. This is the story of Christopher Boyce, codename the Falcon, and Andrew Dalton Lee, codename the Snowman. Two boys who grew up 2 houses apart in a wealthy California suburb, who once served as altar boys together, who fell into espionage not out of ideology or greed alone, but out of a friendship so tangled it became indistinguishable from betrayal. Before this story ends, one of them will vanish into the Idaho wilderness with 37 years left on his sentence. The other will spend his life trying to explain why he did it at all, and you will be left wondering, as investigators still do today, whether either of them ever told the whole truth. Now, let's begin where it always begins, with an ordinary young man walking through the front doors of a defense contractor believing he was doing something noble. Rancho Palos Verdes, California, sat on a bluff above the Pacific, the kind of neighborhood where lawns were manicured and futures were assumed. Christopher Boyce grew up there, one of 8 children in a devout Catholic household. His father had once been an FBI agent before becoming the director of security for a major aircraft manufacturer. It was, in many ways, the perfect pedigree for the career Christopher would fall into, and the perfect irony for the crime he would commit. Boyce was intelligent, restless, and quietly contemptuous of authority. He had dropped in and out of college, drawn more to falconry, the ancient practice of training birds of prey, than to any conventional ambition. His closest friend since childhood was Andrew Dalton Lee, a boy from a similarly comfortable family, the adopted son of a respected physician. But where Boyce was cerebral and detached, Lee was volatile, restless in a different way. By his teenage years, he was already dealing drugs, moving from marijuana into cocaine and heroin, developing the kind of criminal instincts that would later make him useful for a purpose neither of them yet imagined. In 1974, at 21, Boyce was hired by TRW, a major aerospace and defense contractor based in Redondo Beach. It should have been unremarkable. An entry-level position at a sprawling company that built components for America's most classified surveillance satellites. But within months, something happened that changed the trajectory of his life. Boyce was promoted into a restricted, windowless communications room that employees called the Black Vault. Inside that vault, Boyce was given a top-secret clearance and placed in charge of an encrypted teletype system, a direct communications link between TRW and the CIA. He was, in effect, handed a front-row seat to some of the most sensitive secrets of the American intelligence community. The technical specifications of spy satellites, the codes used to secure them, and the CIA's raw internal cable traffic. Imagine being 21 years old, still uncertain about your place in the world, and suddenly holding the keys to secrets that could shift the balance of global power. For most people, the sheer weight of that responsibility would be sobering. For Christopher Boyce, it became something else entirely, a slow-burning fuse. At first, Boyce did his job. He filed cables, encrypted messages, watched the machinery of American espionage hum along in the background of his daily routine. But cables meant for other desks sometimes crossed his terminal by mistake, misrouted, unfiltered, revealing more than they should have. What he began to read disturbed him. According to Boyce's own later testimony, the traffic suggested that the CIA was not simply gathering intelligence abroad. It was actively working to manipulate the internal politics of Australia, a close American ally. The cables referenced covert efforts connected to the removal of Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, a leader who had pushed to shut down sensitive joint U.S.-Australian facilities and pulled troops from Vietnam. Boyce would later claim he'd even seen references to the Governor-General of Australia being discussed by CIA officers as "our man." Whatever the full truth of those cables, the effect on Boyce was immediate and radicalizing. He had grown up in the shadow of Vietnam, already suspicious of a government he believed operated by different rules behind closed doors than the ones it preached in public. Now he believed he held documentary proof. He considered briefly going to a journalist. But it was 1975, the same year the press was still absorbing revelations of CIA involvement in the overthrow of Chile's government 2 years earlier, disclosures that had shocked the public but changed remarkably little in practice. Boyce concluded that exposing the truth through legitimate channels would accomplish nothing. If the system couldn't be shamed into changing, he reasoned, maybe it could be punished instead. It was a catastrophic piece of reasoning, one built on real grievances but leading to an act that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with betrayal. Because Christopher Boyce did not go to a newspaper. He went to his childhood friend, the drug dealer 2 doors down, and asked him a question that would define both of their lives. Would he be willing to carry something to Mexico City? Andrew Dalton Lee already had contacts south of the border. He used Mexico as a route for smuggling narcotics into California. Boyce's proposal folded neatly into an infrastructure Lee already understood. Only this time, instead of drugs, Lee would be carrying rolls of stolen microfilm. Instead of dealers, he would be meeting Soviet intelligence officers at the KGB residency inside the Soviet embassy. Boyce would later insist he lied to Lee at the outset, telling him the documents were meant only to embarrass the CIA over its Australian operations, not to be sold outright to a foreign adversary. Whether that was ever fully true is one of the enduring disputes of the case. What is not disputed is what happened next. Lee walked into the Soviet embassy in Mexico City and came out with cash. The KGB, it turned out, was extremely interested. Boyce had access to details about the Rhyolite Reconnaissance Satellite Program, one of America's most closely guarded intelligence assets, capable of intercepting Soviet missile telemetry and communications from geostationary orbit. He also had access to the cipher systems used to secure communications between the ground stations and the satellites themselves. For a nation locked in a silent arms race fought largely through orbiting hardware and stolen blueprints, this was an extraordinary gift. Over the next roughly year and a half, from the spring of 1975 into the winter of 1976, Boyce photographed and smuggled documents out of the Black Vault with unnerving regularity, and Lee ferried them to Mexico City again and again, meeting Soviet handlers who began referring to the 2 young Californians by their now famous code names. Boyce, drawn to the sport of falconry, was called the Falcon. Lee, perhaps as a mocking nod to his drug-dealing nickname, or perhaps for a photograph staged with an actual snowman, became the Snowman. The Soviets paid them in total somewhere around $70,000 to $76,000. Lee, as the courier and negotiator, kept the larger share, funneling much of it directly back into expanding his narcotics trade. Boyce, who had started this as an act of political conscience, took a smaller cut, a detail that should trouble anyone tempted to view him purely as an idealist. Whatever grievance had lit the fuse, greed and momentum kept the operation running long after any moral justification had worn thin. And here is where the friendship that started this entire chain of events began, quietly, to rot. Lee grew increasingly erratic, reckless with money, reckless with drugs, reckless with his own cover. Boyce, watching from a distance, grew increasingly afraid that his supposed friend was going to get them both killed, or worse, caught. By late 1976, cracks were showing everywhere. The Soviets, growing wary of Lee's instability, began treating him with open suspicion. During one meeting, Lee, high, paranoid, and increasingly convinced he was being cheated, reportedly grew so agitated that Soviet officers physically threw him out of the embassy grounds. It was the kind of scene that should have ended the entire operation right there. It didn't. Boyce, meanwhile, was living a double life that was fraying at the seams. He continued to show up to the Black Vault, continued to photograph documents, continued to hand them to a man he no longer fully trusted, a man he later claimed was blackmailing him, threatening to expose the operation to authorities, or worse, to sell duplicate copies of the documents to a third party entirely, allegedly the Chinese government. Whether that claim was true, or a story Boyce constructed later to soften his own culpability at trial, remains disputed to this day. What is certain is that the operation was now a runaway train, driven by a man spiraling deeper into addiction and paranoia, dragging along a partner who had lost control of the very scheme he had started. The end came not through brilliant counterintelligence work, but through carelessness, the kind that so often brings down even the most sophisticated conspiracies. On January 6, 1977, Andrew Dalton Lee was standing outside the Soviet embassy in Mexico City when Mexican police approached him, not for espionage, but for littering. He had thrown something to the ground near the embassy gates. It was an almost absurdly small thing to trip over. A piece of trash. A routine stop, the kind of encounter that happens to careless tourists every day in any major city. But when police searched Lee, they found rolls of undeveloped microfilm in his possession. Technical material relating to a classified American satellite communications study. He was taken into custody and, under interrogation, confessed. Imagine the moment that confession reached back to California, the machinery of American counterintelligence suddenly snapping awake, tracing the thread back from a jittery young man in a Mexican jail cell to a defense contractor's secure communications vault, and finally to the quiet, unassuming young man who worked inside it. Christopher Boyce was arrested shortly afterward in California. The Falcon had finally been grounded. The trial that followed became a national sensation, and unexpectedly an international one. Because Boyce did not simply plead guilty and disappear quietly into the federal prison system. He used the witness stand as a platform. Under oath, Boyce testified in detail about the cables he claimed to have seen, the alleged CIA effort to help engineer the downfall of Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam 2 years earlier, and claims that TRW communications included efforts to manipulate Australian labor unions to suppress strikes disrupting operations at the jointly run Pine Gap Intelligence Facility. For Australians who had already suspected foreign interference in Whitlam's 1975 dismissal, one of the most controversial constitutional crises in their nation's history, Boyce's testimony poured fuel directly onto a fire that had never fully gone out. Australian newspapers ran the story for weeks. Journalists and politicians demanded answers Washington was never going to give. But sympathy for Boyce's political grievances did not translate into leniency in an American courtroom. On May 15, 1977, he was convicted on multiple counts of espionage. The judge sentenced him to 40 years in federal prison. Andrew Dalton Lee, whose role as the courier and negotiator with Soviet officers was considered even more directly damaging, received a life sentence. For most people, this is where the story would end. 2 young men, their futures extinguished before the age of 30, locked away as a cautionary tale about ideology curdling into betrayal. But Christopher Boyce was not finished making headlines. Not even close. Boyce was transferred to the federal penitentiary at Lompoc, California, a facility that, at the time, held a mix of white-collar and lower-security inmates. It was widely regarded as one of the softer prisons in the federal system, a fact that would prove to be a serious miscalculation by the Bureau of Prisons. On the night of January 21, 1980, Boyce put a plan into motion that had clearly been rehearsed with meticulous patience. With assistance from fellow inmates, he hid inside a drainage culvert near the prison's perimeter for more than 3 hours, waiting for the right moment. His legs went numb from the cold and the stillness. He would later admit it nearly ended the escape before it began. Using a makeshift ladder and a pair of tin snips, he cut through the barbed wire fencing and vanished into the California night. When word reached the command post that the Falcon was loose, the message relayed back was almost theatrically fitting. The Falcon's aloft. What followed was not a dash for the Mexican border, as many assumed. Boyce made his way north, deep into the mountains of northern Idaho, near a remote town called Bonner's Ferry, where he found shelter in an isolated cabin. And there, for the next year and a half, while federal marshals and the CIA chased false leads across 3 continents, one of America's most wanted fugitives simply waited. He assumed a new identity, he worked odd jobs, and, driven by a plan that revealed just how far his politics had hardened, he committed a string of bank robberies, 17 of them, across Idaho and Washington state, reportedly to fund a final, desperate goal, passage to the Soviet Union, where he apparently still believed he might be received as a hero rather than a hunted man. For 19 months, the trail went cold, and then, on the evening of August 21, 1981, a surveillance team combing a small town in Port Angeles, Washington, drove past a modest roadside diner. Inside a car parked alone in the lot sat a man they nearly overlooked. When he looked up, they recognized him instantly. 5 deputy marshals and 2 FBI agents surrounded the vehicle. Christopher Boyce, the man who had eluded the largest manhunt in the Marshal Service's history, was taken without a struggle, eating what may have been his last quiet meal as a free man. Boyce received an additional 28 years for the escape and the robberies, a sentence that, combined with his original 40, effectively ensured he would die in prison. He spent much of the following 2 decades in and out of solitary confinement, surviving what he later described as repeated attempts on his life by other inmates who considered him a traitor to his country in the most literal sense. But the final act of this story did not belong to Boyce or Lee. It belonged to a young paralegal named Kate Mills, who took up Andrew Dalton Lee's case in the 1980s, believing, rightly or wrongly, that Lee had been manipulated by a smarter, more calculating friend who bore greater moral responsibility for what happened. For nearly 2 decades, she fought through the legal system for his release. Lee was finally paroled in 1998. Mills then turned her attention to Boyce. Over the course of that fight, something unexpected happened. A relationship formed between the young advocate and the aging inmate she was trying to free. In September 2002, after 24 years behind bars, Christopher Boyce was released on parole. He and Kate Mills married soon after. And here is the detail that still unsettles anyone who studies this case closely. To this day, Boyce and Lee have never fully agreed on what actually happened, or why. Boyce, in later interviews, described himself simply as an angry young man, a phrase that explains everything and nothing at once. He maintained that Lee had pressured and blackmailed him into continuing an operation he wanted to end. Lee, for his part, has suggested it was Boyce who orchestrated and controlled the entire scheme from the beginning, using their friendship as leverage. Neither account fully survives scrutiny. Neither man has ever offered a version of events that resolves every contradiction. So, what in the end was Christopher Boyce? A principled young man radicalized by genuine evidence of government wrongdoing, who made one catastrophic decision and then couldn't find his way back. or a bored, disaffected 21-year-old who used politics as a convenient justification for something closer to thrill-seeking and quiet resentment? Was Andrew Dalton Lee simply a drug dealer swept up in a friend's crusade? Or was he, as some later suggested, the one actually driving the operation, using Boyce's access and conscience as tools for his own profit? Robert Lindsay's 1979 book on the case, later adapted into a feature film, cemented the two men in popular memory as the Falcon and the Snowman, a phrase that sounds almost romantic, like something out of a spy novel rather than a genuine act of Cold War betrayal that compromised some of America's most sensitive satellite intelligence for less than $80,000. Christopher Boyce eventually returned to falconry, the sport that gave him his code name, flying birds of prey across the open land of Oregon, where he settled quietly with his wife after decades in federal custody. He gave interviews from time to time, always circling the same unanswered question every documentary, every journalist, every true crime enthusiast still asks: how does a young man raised in comfort, surrounded by every institutional advantage America can offer, come to believe that selling his country's secrets to its greatest adversary is not treason, but justice? 6 decades of Cold War espionage cases have produced spies driven by ideology, spies driven by money, spies driven by resentment and ego. Christopher Boyce may be the only one whose downfall began not with a foreign recruiter, but with a childhood friendship that neither man ever fully understood, and neither man, even now, has ever fully explained.